Hi, everybody. Yeah, a little enthusiasm. How's everybody doing tonight? We typically don't allow yelling in a library, but you are allowed to yell for this one moment if you so desire. After that, you know. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. And thank you to everyone who's watching online. My name is Aiden, and I'm part of the team that brings you live from NYPL. So yeah, give it up for Live from NYPL, right? We do a pretty good job. We try anyway. And I get to introduce two amazing women who are here to talk about an incredible new book tonight. First and foremost, of course, we are here to celebrate the killer new novel, Land of Milk and Honey, by our guest of honor, Pam Zhang. Yeah. We're just so thrilled that she's joining us for Live from NYPL, as we are, of course, that she's being joined by the one and only Padma Lakshmi. That's right, give it up. It's a pretty solid duo. It's one of the many, many events we have at Live this fall that we're super excited about. So I'm going to tell you about a couple others because that's really my job standing up here. Friday, we have one of the best events of the year. It's our Halloween costume contest, book-themed costume contest judged by Tim Gunn and NYPL librarians. It's, I think, the 7th year that we've done it. It is the best night. We might be sold out, but maybe there's some standby. It's worth waiting. It's really, really fun. And if you can't make it in, we love Tim so much that he's going to be back the next week to interview the world's most famous classicist. I don't know if you knew there is a world's most famous classicist, Mary Beard, who's just published her new book, Emperor of Rome, a follow-up to SPQR. After that, Terrence Hayes will present an evening of readings and conversation with Nicole Seeley and Amma Kojo. On the centenary of its publication, we're going to examine the legacy of Khalil Gibran's The Prophet with Tony Shalhoub, Rhonda Gerard, and more. Later in the year, Cliff Nestroff, the cultural historian, is going to talk with Mark Maron about the history of the culture wars in America. We're going to present a short documentary by the legendary Sheila Nevins about the ABCs of book banning. And December 15th, put it in your calendars, the other most fun night of the year at the library after hours, where we take over the whole building and throw a party on Fridays after the library closes. So I love all this clapping. This is great. All of that's at nypl.org/live. It's all free, so please join us for all of it. But back here tonight, Pam is, I guess, a friend of the library. She's been a Cullman Fellow. Her first book, How Much of These Hills is Gold, was a finalist for the library's Young Lions Fiction Award. How many of you read that book? So good, right? Amazing. Her new book is equally amazing, but for like totally different reasons. So if you haven't picked up a copy of it already, it's available for sale outside. She'll be signing it afterward, I believe, right up here on this stage. Proceeds go to benefit the New York Public Library, and you are going to have a really killer novel. You could also get it with your library card, and I'm sure with your enthusiasm, you all have library cards, right? This is great. Okay. Well, so these are all the ways you can get the books. Also, Pam recommended some fantastic books in the programs. You can get all of those with your library cards as well. Please don't point out to us that it says Thursday on that program. We recognize that it's Tuesday, but we're just trying to trick you. So afterward, Pam will be signing books up here. I believe that you can line up starting over here if you'd like to get your book signed. And the only other thing I want to let you know before we get going is that you have some note cards you were given when you came in. Those are for asking questions. Pam will be very glad to answer some of your questions at the end. Just write them down. Some of my friends will be collecting them, and we will make sure that she gets them and answers as many as she can. And if you're watching online, you can put your question in the chat, or you can email publicprograms@nypl.org. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isbahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos. We are very grateful for their support. We are even more grateful that you're all here. Let's give it up for Pam Zhang and Padma Lakshmi.
Very nice to see this very crowded room. How's everybody doing? Good? I'm so incredibly excited to be here with Pam. Pam Zhang has written an extraordinary book, which was sent to me early in Galley, and I don't do many of these talks, so if I fuck this up, I'm really sorry. The book is really good in spite of whatever I achieve here tonight or not, and that's why I'm here, because I love the book so much. I'm going to have Pam read from a portion of the book first, and then we're going to just get into it because there's so much to talk about. This novel impressed me, it kept me up at night, it vexed me at points, and it's a completely beguiling, strange, beautiful, special, different novel.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Padma. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. This is...
Can I get a round of applause, please?
Oh, my God. Also, since my friend Kat Chow has insisted on embarrassing, I'm going to embarrass her because it's her birthday. So happy birthday, Kat. I am going to read a short bit from the very opening chapter of the novel. All you need to know is it is a book in which a toxic smog of unknown origin has descended over the earth and killed the majority of food crops. And our protagonist is an unnamed American chef who starts the book off trapped in England. And she gets this mysterious job offer to work at a mountaintop colony of the uber wealthy, where compared to the rest of the world who are left eating this sort of like gray, soylent-like meal replacement, this colony has access to fresh ingredients. So I'm just going to read when she first enters the kitchen. On my second pass, I spotted a box behind the kitchen door. "Impress me," this note said. Inside were flour, vanilla, eggs. I'd expected a test, of course, a textbook omelet or a flawless consommé to prove the French training the job demanded. Pastry, no. Giddiness abandoned me as I unpacked baking soda, sugar, milk. Even the voluptuousness of the butter couldn't distract from thoughts of my spotty experience in patisserie, and the precarity of my work visa, and what would happen were I turned away. And then I was no longer thinking, because at the bottom of the box, I touched something as warm as skin, as yielding as a woman's inner thigh. Strawberries. Amen, I heard myself say, wet-mouthed. I was surprised my breath didn't smudge the air. Red, that color of desire. I began again and said the whole prayer, "Our Father through daily bread." Not my words. They belonged to a pastry chef I'd loved, a lapsed Catholic who rediscovered his faith each morning as he fingered the day's shipment of fruit, and forgot it anew each afternoon as we fucked among the butter and jam. He was the first to take seriously my appetites, my ambitions. He never stored a strawberry cold. Close to the stem, he said, closest to the earth, their perfume is complex, not sugar. Closer to flesh, the flesh of a loved one, not sanitized, not anodyne, but full of many waters. Strawberries and spring, strawberries and musk, strawberries and sex flooded back as I crushed my tongue to sugar. I'd come to that country hardly daring for bitter green, and here, now, this rupturing sweetness. I couldn't remember what hour it was, how many time zones I had crossed, when I'd last eaten. For years I'd fed, survived, swallowed my portions of gray. But had I hungered for pleasure? I'll end there.
We'll get to the language in a second, but first I just want to start by, talking about the setting. And Land of Milk and Honey is set in this kind of unspecified time, what I think is in the near future. Some reviewers have called it dystopian, and so I'd like to talk about that for a second. But the story requires also a considerable amount of world building. And what I love is not only how you create the outside world that it's set in, that you briefly talked about before you read, but also the additional, very different world, the contrasting world of that isolated mountain community. And, you know, most of the protagonists spend most of their time there. And that world reveals itself slowly. And that creates this tension of suspense, right? We find out about it as the chef discovers more and more of where she's agreed to come and work. And I just want to know how you went about creating that world and what some of your inspirations may have been. Talk about the dichotomy of the two worlds and also this word dystopian.
Yeah, big questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, is it the future? I kind of jokingly say I think it's our world plus or minus 0 to 36 months, so it could be right around the corner. So I suppose your definition of dystopian depends on what your life is like, you know? Certainly the kind of dramatic contrast in the two worlds that the chef moves between, the really gray and dismal world that most of the people on this planet live on, and this extraordinarily luxurious and decadent and fertile world on the mountaintop. That contrast was inspired by the fact that I wrote this book in 2021 while we were still deep in the pandemic. And it was just a strange time to be, right? I certainly had many creature comforts. I was very lucky to have them. And I also had this deep awareness that there were other experiences happening globally all around me that I could sort of see but not touch, right? And that I think that kind of disparity is just an artifact of living in the modern age and something I wanted to grapple with in the book. I also, because I wrote this book in such a hard time in my life, I wanted it to really be a portal to pleasure and wonder and this sense of there still being things to discover. Hence that idea of suspense that you were talking about, this sense that the chef, as she moves through this mountaintop colony, literally feels like behind each door there's like a new wonder, there's a new magic, and some of that magic is science, and that's kind of how science feels to me as a lay person.
And what do you think of the word dystopian?
I'm perfectly happy with people using it. I think that in general, I don't mind whatever labels people put on my books. I find them really interesting. I think they reveal a lot about the reader and what they think. But I think the book belongs to the reader once it's out in the world, so feel free to tell me any interpretations.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the novel also, explores several concurrent themes, right? Topics that occupy a lot of chatter in our culture, and of course social media, and everything from animal husbandry to modern gastronomy, of course, but also its fetishization and climate change, as well as disparity, between the 1% and the rest of humankind that we talked about. But there's also tender attention given to the pleasure of pleasure itself. And especially in a dying world, this dystopian world, right? So were these themes something that you set out to talk about when you started writing the book, or did those themes sort of unfold, as you went along in the writing process?
Yeah, I can't write knowing what's going to happen next. I'm very into this idea, and I'm sort of paraphrasing from the poet Jericho Brown, that to create anything I have to write into an unknown, and the moment I know how it ends, it's sort of dead on the page. That project is dead for me. And so what I knew I had at the beginning of this novel was this sense of urgency and this sense of despair of this chef who has, worked for one thing her entire life, who has been this incredibly ambitious woman who wanted to make it to the upper echelons of her career, and suddenly has seen that her ambitions have fallen away. It's no longer possible. There's no longer food to cook on this earth. And so that question of what do you do as a woman with your ambition, and when the sort of components of that seem to have fallen away, right? When the external components and rewards seem to have fallen away, how do you sort of relocate ambition and satisfaction within yourself. And I think the answer to that question, or one of the answers, came to be pleasure. I think that to write about pleasure is rather difficult in this day and age because women's pleasure especially is automatically codified as frivolous, right? Suspect, maybe even immoral or silly. It sort of exists in those sort of like lesser realms. It's not taken very seriously. And I wanted to take it extremely seriously because I think pleasure is a really complicated intellectual question in this day and age, right? It certainly doesn't mean the same thing for everyone, and I think there is also sort of a dangerous assumption that when people say pleasure, we automatically mean luxury and decadence, which is certainly what the incredibly wealthy people in this book associate it with. But in my own life, when I look at the people that I most admire, the women I most admire especially, their pleasure is very complicated and it's very intelligent, and it doesn't look like, sort of billboards and ads of vacation homes or sun-drenched beaches. It often looks more intimate and smaller and simpler, and it is so often informed by their communities and the rest of the world. The people that I most respect, the women that I most respect, they can't truly have pleasure if it doesn't also sort of consider their place in the world and who they may be extracting that pleasure from and sort of what the repercussions of it are, right? So I just found it to be really interesting. How do you sort of stand on your own 2 feet and identify the sources of your pleasure, kind of in defiance of what external labels are telling you it looks like?
I mean, all the pleasure, as you said, seems a little bit, seems intimate, but at the same time very specific also. And I think, we'll talk about that later when they go down to the village, which is a scene that I love. But, before that, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the food because obviously, as a person who's written about food for over 20 years, I want to acknowledge the exquisite care that you took in describing all the ingredients and also the elaborate dishes that the chef makes and everything that's consumed in the book. Really, it's so lyrical and beautiful, and there's almost this palatable ache that emanates from the page. It's that feeling when you I'm serious. Like I was saying to Pam backstage that I'm normally an auditory person, but this book made me think in a lot of visual images, just snatches of things. And, that ache that I was talking about when she does describe the food or someone enjoying the food, it feels like that feeling when you put something in your mouth and one's brow just furrows with this sensorial bliss, and then it's a feeling that you were able to write about without writing about the feeling. Does that make sense? Like she doesn't describe how they felt when they were eating it. She describes the food, but immediately when I was reading that, I felt what I thought you were insinuating they felt. Most people when they cook, they often don't cook only for themselves, right? Or they don't cook as well just for themselves. A lot of us cook for that moment when somebody has the first taste of your food and they just close their eyes or furrow their brow. It's just that moment. She never uses those words, like, because she's a novelist and I'm not, but she never, but that is what came off the page. And so I don't know how many of you have already read this book, but I really want you to read it. Even there's so many reasons to love this book and enjoy it and savor it, but the food and the way she writes about it viscerally and evocatively is so beautiful and rare, really rare. So that's not really a question. Oh yeah, there's a question here. So are you someone who's always paid attention to food, or has this developed recently? Do you cook?
Well, before I answer that question, Padma, I just want to take a moment. I'm so grateful that you read it that way. It's really beautiful to hear. And as you were speaking, it occurred to me that In a way, I suppose the way I see the relationship between novelist and reader is a little bit like the relationship between, I suppose, like a home cook and somebody that they care about that they're cooking for, right? There's this way in which really great food, and by great, I just mean food made with a lot of emotion, can be like this direct transference of feeling to somebody else, and that's certainly something that I strive to achieve in my work. So thank you for saying that. I forgot your question.
Bill Buford said that it's cooking someone something to eat is the only way you can get into their body without actually touching them. So things like so you're saying. But I was just asking if you were always so, observing of food. Like, was food something that had your attention all your life, or is that something that came when you wanted to write this novel, so you got deeper into it? I just want to know the role that food plays in your life.
Yeah, I would have said for the first 18 years of my life that I didn't really like food. I was a very unadventurous eater. I was also a bit squeamish. It came both from the fact that, I grew up in a Chinese American family and we were very poor, so we were rarely able to eat out. And so I didn't have much exposure. But I also was a person who, and this is super embarrassing, but used to only be able to eat chicken breasts with the fat trimmed off. Any amount of gristle or fat freaked me out. That was my relationship with food for a long time. And then there was this interesting period where I think it was senior year of high school, and I had gotten to college, and sort of you're like, I don't have to do anything anymore. And what I did with my time for some reason was start reading food blogs. I don't really know why, but there's this way in which these foods that in the real world, in the physical world, I rarely saw and certainly wasn't really curious about reading about people's experiences with them and the associations that people had with their food. It really opened up something in me, and I was like, I want to feel those emotions that they feel when they eat. I think that was really where it started. And then also furthermore, I remember distinctly, this was, I want to say 2006, so sort of the beautiful wild age of the internet before everything got SEO'd and hashtagged to death, when right? Food blogs were really pure, and there were these two food blogs of Asian American women, one living in New York and one living somewhere in Hawaii, who were dining out at both grimy dim sum places of the sort I was familiar with, and Michelin-starred French restaurants of the kind I had never seen, and sort of being able to describe these, what I thought were completely disparate food experiences with the same aplomb and confidence and joy. And I was like, that's super cool. I never knew that you could approach, French food that way. I never knew that you could, as a person who looked like this and came from this kind of background, have this kind of intimate and knowing relationship with cuisine. So it's really those narrative possibilities that got me into food first.
Ah, that's interesting. Are you an adventurous eater now?
Yeah, I think I am now.
Okay.
Yeah, I will eat anything once.
That's usually what I say.
I was actually listening to this really hilarious podcast called, what is it called? Makes Sense. By Chanel Miller and Karen Sheehan. They had one episode that was about taste, and they brought on, I'm so sorry, I'm forgetting who the guest was, but it was a food writer who said that if she doesn't like a food, it makes her sort of want to go back and taste it more, because she's sort of curious about the source of that dislike. And I think that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, it's just like being a food detective.
Yeah.
You're trying to decipher what you're tasting and why it feels the way it does.
Yeah, well, you're using your brain after you use your tongue.
Yeah. Okay, so also just beyond the food, there's this feeling of longing, right? Of its growing appetites that also adds to the tension of the book. And it's weird. It has this it's not weird, but it's beautiful. It has this thriller
You can say weird.
Huh?
Weird is a compliment.
Great. Yeah, I mean, it's beautiful. It's sort of this. It's a thriller, but I don't know in a traditional sense, but it feels thrilling, certainly. And so there's this longing, this growing of all these appetites that are both physical and emotional that also permeates the book. And it's a hunger not only for survival, but it's a thirst to thrive among all the people who dine there at this mountain lodge, their residents there, and they eat there, and it's very, very rare to be there, right? It's very expensive and stuff. And so, but they're also, even though there's this dying world, they just want to thrive. They're so ambitious about it that it's startling, and it's there in every conversation that they have. Even how they talk about food. I don't want to spoil it, so I won't say. But oh, I'm so sorry. It's really, really beautiful, and it hangs in the air. It's this hunger for an abundance that is just not there because there's hardly any food, right? So how did you create that tension, and can you just speak about that undercurrent? Because I really thought that was a big unseen presence in the book. While you were describing all this other stuff, or things were happening, there was always this white noise of hunger and a lust for, like I said, an appetite for emotional things and physical things. They were always metaphorically grabbing at stuff, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's so insightful, and I love that word you used earlier, ache, to describe it. How do I put this? So, a lot of these desires are expressed through our protagonist, the chef, and they're also expressed through these incredibly wealthy and privileged people who live on the mountain. And there was a way in which I really resisted turning these uber wealthy elite folk into villains. I didn't want them to be two-dimensional. You can't really write a convincing novel if you have any characters that you don't have some level of sympathy for. And so it was the question that I really wanted to excavate was this question of how does the fear of impending loss in a world that feels like it's on the verge of catastrophe change us, right? And how do we act on that fear in ways that are both good and bad, both self-serving and selfless? And I think that regardless of what actions people end up deciding to take, that fear is so very human and so very, very universal. There's a way in which the very wealthy on this mountain kind of define abundance by the definitions of the old world, right? And I don't think this is a spoiler, but there's this sort of intent to sort of save plant and animal species that are dying off everywhere and sort of raise them up, bring them back, some of them for direct consumption. Certain people on the mountain have sort of more grandiose goals for that.
Yeah, say voracious appetites.
Yeah, voracious
ambitious appetites.
Ambitious, yeah.
Let's eat this extinct animal. Let's bring it back so then we can eat it. There's all this husbandry and research that goes on.
Yeah, so I was really, so I suppose that maybe that's the answer. Is I was just really curious about how this fear of impending loss affects people. Because I do think it's also kind of a potentially dangerous emotion, right? We live in an age in which there is so much to grieve for. Every single day, the headlines bring us news of losses all around the world, of human life, of plant and animal life, of just things that I didn't even think we could lose, right? A big part of the inspiration for this book was seeing the wildfire seasons.
Mm-hmm.
I used
in
to
Portland and then.
Well, I used to live in California, and so now I think globally everyone understands wildfire smog and its ability to occlude the sun. But I've been seeing this for 8-9 years, and that first day that you walk outside and the sky is thick gray and the sun is this ghastly orange dot on the horizon, it's horrifying because you're I never thought we could lose the sky.
The sun.
The sun, yeah, is something so fundamentally taken for granted. But I think that also we need to sort of move past that fear. I wonder always how we can find a way to both mourn the things we have lost and are losing, and also not let that bog us down, not let that make us so conservative that we're unable to see sort of other futures and alternate futures, right? How do we stand in the place we are now and say we have lost these things, we will probably lose these other things, and rather than trying to sort of replicate that world, how do we just move forward with the resources and ingenuity that we have into that sort of unknown and that ambiguous space that doesn't necessarily have to be terrifying.
I think it's a form of mourning. Like, you don't want to let it go. So,
Yeah.
with coal or, fossil fuels or anything like that, you just are trying to cling to that old way of life instead of saying part of mourning this loss is letting it go,
Yeah.
is moving on to cleaner energy or whatever. I think it's their inability to mourn it, as you say, that keeps them from letting it go and finding new ways to live.
Yeah.
I'd also, this is just a technical question. I want to know how you went about creating the plot and the storyline. I mean, you said that you don't map things out, but you must have had an idea of where you wanted to wind up. I mean, do you do any outlines? Is that gauche to ask? I'm just really curious.
No, it's not gauche. I think it's more embarrassing because I really just don't know where things are going. Okay, so the idea that I had at the beginning, let's see. I always, this first image of a book is always very clear to me. Sometimes the last image, though not in this case, sometimes key images along the way. I think what helped frame this book was I knew it was going to have it's a framed narrative where the prologue is the narrator as a much older woman looking back on a transformative year in her life. And I wanted it to be concentrated.
In 1 year.
In 1 year. One, because there's a sort of seasonal effect that happens in the book where she arrives from this gray world into a world that is, we're blooming into spring. And then there's like a beautiful, heated, luscious summer, and then there's like fall and winter tapering off, and I wanted that sort of arc to be there in the book. But also the frame narrative came about because during the worst parts of the pandemic, the only books I could read for a while were biographies of women artists and writers, because I really just needed proof. Right? That proof that people could live through periods of hardship and come out the other side, having made something that was artful, something that stood on its own, something that was still good in some way, right? And so that frame of the retrospective kind of gave me an intensity of feeling, right? Stories told through the long lens of memory are often like super saturated with emotion.
Yeah, because they've imbued with layers of memory over the years that you keep coloring in.
You keep coloring in, and you sort of, everything that wasn't important to you individually kind of just falls away, right? So it's like really intense.
Great. So through the chef's character, we also get to experience what it's like to be an Asian woman in a service industry, and specifically in the West, right? The chef muses about her worth at one point about, I love these lines, as my Chineseness, my Asianness, my smallness, my womanness, my foreignness. And it's so subtle, yet clearly there. I think that's, at least that I can remember, that's the only time when she really focuses on it until she's asked to portray someone else later. But, there's so much wrapped up in that. And the way, like I said, the employer gradually forces her to play a role of someone else. And, she has to pretend that she's his spouse at one point, another woman who has passed away, and sort of almost, pretend, just play this whole character in front of people whenever she's seen by other people. And so it's this wonderful metaphor for what Asian women often have to do anyway, which is play a role. And so that was kind of magical to me, and nefarious as well. And so I don't know, it was wonderful to be able to see through her eyes in that way. I just would love for you to speak a bit about that.
Yeah, so that aspect of the protagonist being asked to portray another Asian woman with whom she is considered interchangeable, It's some people have been like, wow, how did you think about them? Like, dude, that's
What?
like, I was like, well, clearly not Asian women. I was like, that's like the most realist part of this like surreal story, right? I mean, it's like, I think my very first professional experience of that was at a conference called the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. People are laughing because it's, I don't know, is it still considered like the most prestigious writers conference you can get into on scholarship? Anyways, and I, gave a reading one night, and the next day, one of my peers, who is this like tiny Japanese woman who's literally like a foot shorter than me, her hair was like down to here, we dressed nothing. We did not look anything alike. It was like, people came and congratulated me on your reading. And I was like, oh, right. Like, I don't know. For some reason, that there was a moment where, like, I was like, yes, this happens to me all the time in the real world, but I thought in, like, the beautiful literary world, in this world of people making their profession from an understanding of, like...
Of observation.
And, like, human empathy, whatever. I was like, wow, it happens here, too. It can happen truly anywhere. I don't know. To be an Asian woman is to be simultaneously hyper-visible, hyper-sexualized, and completely interchangeable. And it's just a fascinating duality. And I was also interested in the ways in which it sucks that it happens. I wish that didn't happen, but can you weaponize it in some small way, right? Mm-hmm. In a world in which you have so little power, the protagonist is in the service industry. She is also on like a really tenuous work visa. She has very, very few levers to pull. Can she weaponize the way people see her? Can she commodify it? And can she get something out of it, even if something is being extracted from her? And it's a question that runs through the book, and I don't think it has a clear answer because, there's certainly ways in which people do this every day around the world, and I definitely, you cannot judge anyone for doing that. Like, take what you have to, right? But one question that runs through the book is sort of like, how far can you let other people define you? How much can you let yourself be pushed into these boxes, into these roles, before you say enough? And at some fundamental level, you just can't sit with it anymore.
You can see why I identified with that. So there's another character, another woman. Her name is Ida, and she's one of the three central characters, along with the chef and the chef's employer. And it's interesting to hear you say that the chef is a very ambitious woman, but when she's talking about taking the job and everything, that is maybe because, as you said, there's no food to cook. Mm-hmm. That is not the impression I got reading it. So Ida is this young woman who's just 20, and she's the daughter of the employer, and she's super ambitious. And, of course, she's also super privileged, so she's always been told she can do whatever she wants and has been allowed to because of her privilege. And I just found her ambition actually in stark contrast to the chef's. And it's almost as if like the chef was taking the job because she had no other great plan at her disposal, right? But Ida has a plan for everything, and even civilization, right? So, and how to save it, which she's heading up all this husbandry and heading up the labs, and she's quite smart, and she has her research, and this is what we were talking about, where they bring back species, and it's such a particular character, and even the way she dresses, right? It's sort of very high goth, like I picture, Boudica and Gaultier and Prada, but all black and silver and really tight, and like pointy and stuff. I'm telling you, I saw every scene. But she's both, also Ida is both irritating and fascinating all at once. At least she irritated the fuck out of me for a while. I was just like, and she's so young as well, which is part of why she's so irritating. I just want to know what creating her was, how much, like, what was that like? It sounds fun. And, is she a composite of people or you don't have to say any names, but,
She really fun to create. I think it's so delightful to create female characters that dare to be irritating, dare to be like too much, dare to like grate on people. And she was created initially as a foil to the protagonist, right? As somebody who is seemingly able to realize all of her ambitions, even to the extent that she sort of like gets on people's nerves and becomes maybe arguably too forceful. But I wanted there to be that argument in the book. Is like, is it too much? And if we think it's too much, why? Like, what qualities of her are we really judging? She also exists in the book because she's a really important person to the protagonist. I think that as women in the world, it is so often hard for us to, let me see how to put this, to allow ourselves to reach for great ambitions, right? We're just sort of socialized to be in service to other people and to think about what other people are going to get out of what we're doing, how we might possibly offend them, how we might possibly encourage them. And so I have often found in my experience that it takes seeing another woman do something in the great extreme to sort of like almost snap me out of it and be like, what can I reach for? What am I allowed? What is permitted? And it takes seeing another physical embodiment of that permission. And I was really, really interested in how that sort of observing of one another between these two characters could function in the novel.
I also thought she was a good contrast to her father, and it spoke to me about how men, I'm grossly generalizing here, but how, when we think of men being ambitious or leading, it's all about control. And I think for him, it's about getting the resources to then subdue and control what's happening to them for him and a select few who pay dearly for it. Whereas Ida's ambition manifests where she's actually trying to follow the science and follow what will take them out of it in a much more proactive way, rather than constricting the small number of people to this isolated place. It's interesting how both father and daughter are so ambitious, but just in different ways, and how that speaks to how, as you put it, women are conditioned to work at it. Let's solve this problem, where men are like, I can control, or they're socialized to be. Not all men are, but I'm just saying, like, there's just this dominance with the dad, with the father, that also was another layer for me, that actually just thinking about it now, I'm realizing.
Yeah, and the fact that that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? I think in this sort of like hopefully post-girl boss era that we live in, right? There's been this like sort of false narrative that to be a successful woman means to like ape the actions of successful men who are frankly like sociopaths. Like to be successful in like a capitalist nation is kind of to develop at least some of the qualities of sociopathy. I mean, it's just true. It is just true. And I'm also interested in the ways in which like women might model other forms of being in power or having ambition or having authority, right? For example, Ida doesn't care at all about being in the spotlight or getting credit. That's like
She just
not
wants to
what
get
she
shit
works for.
done.
She just wants to get shit done. I think it's really interesting to see how some of that might be gendered.
And then what happens? The book is so rich. Even if I told you every plot point, there would be a million things to discover on every page. So I'm not worried about it. I hope you're not. So, like, if you want to know what juicy thing happens, leave now or cover your ears. But the relationship between Ida and the chef builds, and it turns, and then, it twists, and it turns again at a point, right? And there's this air of frustration at Ida's frenetic personality, but then there's an appetite for it too, and then this kind of release. And whenever they're together, the chef and Ida, there's this push and pull. There's, it's often uncomfortable because they're so different, their manner is so different, and yet when they do come together physically, it just feels as if we were waiting for this all along. And it's it's so fraught and so sublime at the same time. I just want to know how you created that energy between them.
Let's see. How did I create that energy? I think a lot of that energy comes from the fact that the chef is deeply isolated on this mountaintop. And isolation can feel really imprisoning, can feel really cold and terrifying, but isolation can also be an interesting form of freedom, right? It can be a moment, if you are, again, a woman who's worked in the service industry, if you're accustomed to serving other people, it can be a moment to be alone and to be forced to ask yourself, what is it that you really want, right? And so I think a lot of the tension and the sense of inevitability between the chef and Ida comes down to the fact that these were desires that had been sort of bubbling beneath the surface of her life for many, many years. And Ida, being this, who she is, kind of embodies many of those desires.
So it's emblematic of,
Yeah.
what she's reaching or longing
Yeah.
for.
Yeah, and I was also interested additionally in sort of possibly subverting the typical relationships that one might encounter as a reader when you see this dynamic of this, like, woman employed by a wealthy, attractive older man, like what kinds of relationships you might expect to emerge. And so when you're surprised by it, like to sort of make the reader reflect on, like, why did they think these dynamics were the only ones? What are you expecting of the world when you read narratives, and what are you surprised by?
Mm-hmm. Well, that leads me, I could talk to you about this all night, but we have some questions from all of you, which I'll read. The last question that I want to ask is, jumping off of that. And there's a scene, and it's a turning point in the book, when Ida and the chef actually go off property, which they are not at all supposed to do. They're supposed to stay on the reservation, but they don't. They go off the property, and they have an accident in the village down below involving some young boys, some children. And in order to placate them, they give them their stash of fresh apples, which, in this world are about as precious as rubies. And, rather than the children enjoying the fruit, they're disgusted by it. They take bites and throw it on the ground or throw it at them. And, like the women in the book, I didn't expect that. So, talking about what you expect to happen and doesn't happen. But it makes such sense once it does happen. And I love the unpredictable detail of that. It talks to what we covet and what we think is precious, and what they've just lost a taste for, that they don't even feel that it's precious anymore. Can you just speak about what you were thinking there, and then we'll get into some of your questions?
Yeah, I think that when we first talked on the phone about that scene, you also made this comment, if I'm allowed to divulge it, about it reminding you of the way that people like go to India and think that they're sort of helping the children there.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's it is. That's what it felt
Yeah.
like to me when you see Western tourists sort of dole out, outside the temple, and they just feel so good about it.
Yeah,
And
I really, that was part of it, as I didn't want it to feel like, just because the people on this mountaintop have privilege and wealth and ingredients, that they're in any way raised to a morally superior plane to these people below who are just like eating gruel and sort of scrabbling. Because within that scrabbling, there's also creativity, there's also ingenuity, there's also the possibility of developing a different palate, a different taste, a different sort of set of rules for what has value. And I didn't want to write a story in which it felt like there was any hint of a savior complex of these people on the mountain coming down and being able to give to the average person. And it's fun because that scene was not in the first draft of the book.
it's a great scene.
The first draft of the book was probably like a bit more predictable, and I was like, it just didn't sit right with me. I was like, what is there in this that's bothering me? And so, yeah, I'm really glad you enjoyed it.
I love that. I mean,
I hate foie gras, and it reminded me of that when people always try to be nice to me and give me this whole lobe of foie gras.
God.
I don't know what to do with it. There's one sitting in my freezer right now. I'm like, I can't waste it after all this goose went through. Okay, so how much of the book's menu was born out of your own cravings versus what could appear on a tasting menu for the 1%?
I think the answer to that is like it's both, right? There's a lot of, I think, veneration now that I look back on it for fresh produce, like the passage that I just read, because that was something that just felt like when we were trapped in our houses, it felt like the only way to sort of reach out and like touch the world and like what was happening and sort of like get something that had absorbed like sunlight and air into our bodies. And the tasting menus, they were really fun to make in the book. There are sort of banquet scenes which some people have told me are borderline revolting.
But I love that about them.
But the thing is, like, those most revolting dishes, I think, like, could exist and do exist to some degree in the real world, right?
Anything can exist.
Yeah.
Anything can exist. And you do kind of, if you're like me or you've lived the life I have and you've sat there while people explain their menu to you, some of it after a while, as luxurious as it's meant to be, obviously, is revolting. It is, because you're like, oh, there's so much stuff on one spoon. But that is what I mean about the fetishization of food. It's exactly that. It just becomes like, it's like I picture that's how people felt in Roman times when right before they went to the vomitorium. It's like, let me kill you with decadence, right?
Yeah.
And that it does have a quality of that. Yeah. So you talked about the idea of pleasure and also how complicated it can be. Would both of you share a food memory that was pleasurable and maybe also complicated? Wow, I'm going to have to think about this one.
That's a hard question.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we should come back to that one.
Yeah,
I think
let's come back to that
it.
one. You've asked a very good question,
good
though.
job.
Okay, this is another question. I read the novel as a social critique of today's wealth gap and the top 1%. Can you discuss this a bit and talk about your motivation or purpose? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I don't think it has like a motivation or a purpose beyond curiosity. About the ways in which privilege manifests itself in the world. I wrote this book in a very strange year. It was during the pandemic, and I had happened to move with my partner to this little town in Washington State called Medina. Sight unseen, we sort of just like picked a rental within our budget and kind of went there, and it ended up being the home of people such as Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates. And we certainly weren't living in those conditions. We were in this sort of like run-down second property on our landlord's property.
Seattle.
Yeah, right.
You were in Seattle.
Yeah, effectively, yeah. But it was this like daily act of walking my dogs around this neighborhood and feeling like there was no neighborhood, there was no community. Everyone lived in these gated compounds behind high hedges, down enormous long driveways. You could see no hint of their lives. I never met, I think, any of my neighbors, really, never got to know them. There was also sort of no public street in this town because everyone had their own private chef, private basketball court, private yacht. Everything, right? And it was just like got me really curious about the difference between community and just a group of people and the ways in which privilege can be just warping in so many ways. Warping as in like warping the outside world and certainly doing some harm there, but also warping emotionally, individually, internally, how it can be really isolating and lonely and end up being a without spoiling any of this book, a kind of a tragedy as well.
Yeah, it can be a prison in a way, right? Yeah. Okay. Do you have a food memory that's complicated but very pleasurable yet?
No, I don't.
You don't? Okay.
You can share yours if you've come up with one.
Okay, hold on. I've lost the order here. We've asked that. Okay, I do have a food memory. I'll tell you really quickly. I wrote about it in my memoir, Love, Lost, and What We Ate. I've only been to Noma once, to Rene Redzepi's restaurant, and my partner, this is before he died, we went on this food fantasy tour. And so we flew to Copenhagen, and we were eating one night in Copenhagen there at Noma, which is a 7-course tasting menu, at least it was in those days. And I'm talking about like 13 years ago. And the next night, we flew to Rosa's, and we ate at El Bulli before it closed down, which was a 50-course meal. But I'm just going to talk to you about the first part of it, which is the Noma experience. And it was beautiful. You know, it was this boy's love letter to the woods, you know, in Scandinavia that he'd grown up in, and everything is so hyper-local, and it was beautiful, and there's all this sort of hushed pomp and circumstances in this understated way, and they all come, and you know, they sort of have a hot stone, and they crack an egg, and it sizzles, and it fries right at your table, and they come and they singe hay, so, you know, it's like a whole experience, and I was totally into it. And at the same time, my partner was going through something really serious, not even related to his health, but he just kept having to be on the phone and talk about this crisis that was happening back in New York. And sometimes he would go outside because, you know, there was nice restaurants. Sometimes he would just be there. And I loved how, you know, I loved the food, and I wanted to have this experience, and we were having it. And I loved how we didn't know he was sick at the time. He was probably already sick, and he just would refuse. And I said, we don't have to go. Like, we can leave and just have you deal with this crisis. It's okay. It's just food. And he was so determined to enjoy this meal and not let this incredibly stressful crisis unfold as he was going through a health issue. And the waiters as well were trying so valiantly to just still fawn over us and, you know, give us all the 7 courses. And your first course is actually already on the table. It's this pot of geraniums with these snails on them that you actually just pick up and eat. And then you sort of take out the flowers, and lo and behold, it's a 2-year carrot that is, you know, soaked in yogurt and malt. And all the while, he's on the phone with lawyers and all this stuff. And so it was a wonderful meal. It was a experience that I will not forget, because I've had a lot of tasting menus by a lot of very, very talented and brilliant chefs, but the beauty of that, just the 7 courses of not doing too much but doing so much, was so pleasurable in so many ways, intellectually and viscerally and just hedonistically and sensorially. And at the same time, there was this, you know, very powerful white noise of threat that was befalling him and us, and one that we didn't even know of. And so that's my pleasurable, very complicated food memory.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome. You have to think of something.
Mine sounds so dumb now. I'll share it, but it's not like that. I was just thinking about the last time I went to, so I learned in the last couple of years I'm gluten intolerant. Like, gluten won't kill me, but like I shouldn't eat it, et cetera, et cetera. And most specifically, like gluten and then sugar and then also alcohol just don't mix very well in my system. But I recently like went to this restaurant called Public Display of Affection, ironically enough, in Brooklyn. Amazing restaurant, and they have this Detroit style pizza that's just so good, like on a double fermented sourdough crust.
Yeah.
It's like, and you know, I was there with my partner. I was like, I'll just eat like one little bite of the gluten. It won't kill me. Of course, I ended up eating like
The whole thing.
most of the slice. And then I was like, I'll just drink this, like, you know, this cocktail. It's too late.
Fuck it.
Yeah. And so very quickly, you know, the meal ended very badly. In the bathroom, I think I was like blacking out. At some point, I was just like, it's just like classic sort of moral story of how too much
Eat now, pay later.
Yeah. So.
Okay, I think we have one last question. The book arc seems to be in part about the chef's rediscovery of pleasure. It also seems like she has to experience the more rarefied, elevated pleasure to experience more humble ones, for lack of a better word, later in the book. Would you agree with that, or do you see it differently?
For her, that's a really great question. I don't know that everyone has to experience like rarefied forms of pleasure to enjoy the humble ones, but I think certainly for this chef, because she's been educated in a particular culinary style, which is Francophile, which puts Western fine dining on a pedestal, which is kind of just the rules of the Western world and honestly most of the world in general, right? For
It's its
her,
own colonization and imperialism.
Exactly, it is imperialism, right? One of the questions that sort of like got me thinking about this book was this question of like, why are most people, like the average American, maybe not you, but the average American, like okay with, say, the idea that a chicken dish on a French menu could cost $60 or $70, but if you told them to pay $30 for one at a Chinese restaurant, they'd just balk, right? And that difference in value is literally the difference in value between how those two culinary cultures are perceived, how those cultures and countries in general are perceived, how the people, the value and the difference in value between the people who make that food. And so for the chef, because she has so long oriented herself around this Francophile understanding of the world, she does, I think, unfortunately, kind of have to.
She's internalized
She's
the
internalized
colonization.
it. She has. So she kind of does have to sort of like have those tastes hit her at a very primal, visceral level to kind of understand what she actually enjoys. And
To
what she
wake
actually
her
prizes.
up.
Yes.
To those things that she had with her mother. Yeah, it's sort of internalized colonialism, right?
Yeah, definitely is. It is interesting.
Colonial mentality.
It is because it's horrible, but your palate can be colonized. Your palate is colonized. Your palate is so determined by like what you've eaten, but also like signals from the outside world about what you're eating.
Totally. I didn't like peanut butter until I was 36. And I grew up here. I just thought it was the most disgusting thing ever. And every time I took it home to India, my grandmother was like, "What is this quicksand that you keep bringing in a jar back home? Pringles and, Skippy peanut butter or whatever." Yeah.
I thought that I couldn't eat cheese until I was like, I think like 20 or 21 because, I mean, here's the thing. Like, now I love it. It's, I love cheese, but I just have to say it so that no one comes after me.
I love cheese too, but Asians often can't handle it.
I mean, it wasn't just handling. It was just that when you grow up in a culinary culture that like eats very little dairy, and it's just like, think about what cheese is. You take like something that came from the udder of a cow, and then you
spoil
it. It's often covered with mold, right? It's like oozing. It literally looks like something you should not be putting in your mouth.
Yeah. That's how I felt when people were eating Stilton, like with wild abandon in England. It was everywhere, and you could smell it across the restaurant.
And yet they're scared of spices.
Yeah.
It's wild, yeah.
I cannot recommend this book more. I loved it in so many ways. I want to go back and read it again and just experience all the pleasure that it gives. Pam Zhang, thank you for giving me such a wonderful reading experience. And, as you can imagine, I wince when a lot of people decide to, this is not a food novel, but it could be considered that, or movies on food, and they just make me gag because they're so twee and precious and earnest and, kind of like that. And I just want to say, this has language that in lesser hands could totally be this quick, which is why it's so extraordinary. The language of this book is so unlike what you normally read in what we consider lauded literature or contemporary literature, that it's so wonderful to be so lascivious, with words. I'll just say that. It's sort of this, pornographic use of language, which I highly, highly recommend.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you all for coming and joining us for this very intimate and crowded talk. I'm glad you got to meet her in person. I'm certainly glad to finally meet you in person. And that concludes our program for this evening. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for your thoughtful questions as well.